Okay, so last time we talked about how Bennett was an ardent anti-communist. That somewhat backfired. There was rising anti-government sentiment with the privations that came with the Great Depression in Canada. And following the lead of President Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States, Bennett, under the advice of William Duncan Harridge, who was both Canada's ambassador to the U.S. and Bennett's brother-in-law, the government eventually began to follow the Americans' lead. In a series of 5 speeches to the nation in January of 1935, Bennett introduced a Canadian version of the New Deal involving unprecedented public spending and federal intervention in the economy, progressive income taxation, a minimum wage, a maximum number of working hours per week, unemployment insurance, health insurance, an expanded pension program, and grants to farmers were all included in the plan. This was really more extensive than the New Deal. In one of his addresses to the nation, Bennett said, quote, "In the last 5 years, great changes have taken place in the world. The old order is gone. We are living in conditions that are new and strange to us. Canada on the dole is like a young and vigorous man in the poorhouse. If you believe that things should be left as they are, you and I hold contrary and irreconcilable views. I am for reform, and in my mind, reform means government intervention. It means government control and regulation. It means the end of laissez-faire." Now, that's a pretty dramatic statement coming from the head of the Conservative Party in Canada. So it's a pretty dramatic transformation. Bennett's dramatic conversion, however, was seen as too little, too late, and he faced criticism that his reforms either went too far or did not go far enough, including from one of his own cabinet ministers, H.H. Stevens, who was the Minister of Trade and Commerce. He bolted from the government to form the Reconstruction Party of Canada. So we see some of this radical third-party stuff going, and the Reconstruction Party actually would have accused Bennett of going not far enough. It called for massive government intervention. So we see these sort of radical third-party movements in Canada like we do in the U.S. Some of the measures were alleged to have encroached on provincial jurisdictions, as laid out in Section 92 of the British North America Act, which is part of the Canadian Constitution. And the courts, including the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, that's the highest court of appeal in Canada, agreed and eventually struck down virtually all of Bennett's reforms. Here's a more recent picture of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. It's like the U.S. Supreme Court. Why they're dressed like Santa's helpers, I don't know. But anyway, as with the U.S., but even more extensively, they strike down virtually all of Bennett's New Deal initiatives. Some survived, like the Bank of Canada, a central bank, which was finally created under Bennett, although it was created as a private corporation. Founded that in 1934. That survived. The Canadian Wheat Board also survived. This was a producer marketing system and remains in place to this day. Basically, and you can see how reading whose names are unknown, this would have been beneficial to farmers, that this board will buy all of Canada's wheat. Set up a situation so that Canada only had one buyer of wheat in the country, the Wheat Board. That is called a monopsony. We'll talk about that in class. Bennett was defeated in the 1935 elections and the Liberals returned to power. He retired to Britain in 1938, even though he was not from there. And on June 12, 1941, became the first and only former Canadian Prime Minister to be elevated to the peerage as Viscount Bennett. He was made a Viscount. And while Bennett was and is still often criticized for lack of compassion for the impoverished masses, sort of as a coda to his life, we'll say that he did actually stay up many nights, actually reading and responding to personal letters from ordinary citizens asking for his help. He often dipped into his considerable personal fortune to send a $5 bill to a starving family. The total amount he gave personally is uncertain, although it's estimated that between the years of 27 to 37, he spent well over $2 million. He was controlling director of the E.B. Eddy Match Company. It was the largest safety match manufacturer in Canada and was one of the richest Canadians at that time. He also helped put many poor, struggling young men through university. extremely severe, austere almost constitution. He never smoked or drank or worked on the Sabbath if he could help it, based on the promise he made to his mother. He died, I believe, in 48. And so William Lyon McKenzie King comes back as PM. He was trained in law and social work, and he was keenly interested in the human condition. As a boy, his motto was, "Help those that cannot help themselves." According to his biographers, McKenzie King lacked the typical personal attributes of great leaders, especially the ones that happened to dot the stage when he was PM: Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle. Voters did not love him. He lacked charisma, a commanding presence, or oratorical skills. He did not shine on the radio or a newsreel. His best writing was academic. He was kind of cold and tactless in human relations. He had allies, but no close personal friends. He never married. Curiously, neither did Bennett, and lacked a hostess whose charm might, substitute for his chill. His allies were annoyed by his constant intrigues. He was a political intriguer. He kept secret, for obvious reasons, his beliefs in spiritualism and the use of mediums to stay in contact with departed associates. Yeah, I know, we got Maduro and now King. Some of the people he would talk to through mediums, Leonardo da Vinci, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, who was his mentor, his dead mother, and several of his Irish Terrier dogs. He has a succession of dogs all named Pat, except one that was named Bob. I'm not making this up. So, given all these personal liabilities, why was he the Prime Minister of Canada? Well, historians conclude that McKenzie King remained so long in power because he had remarkable skills that were exactly appropriate to Canada's needs. He was keenly sensitive to the nuances of public policy. He was a workaholic with a shrewd and penetrating intelligence and profound understanding of how society and the economy worked. He understood labor and capital. He had a pitch-perfect ear for the Canadian temperament and mentality and was a master of timing. He was a modernizing technocrat. McKenzie King worked tirelessly to bring compromise and harmony to many competing and feuding elements, using politics and government action as his instruments. In 1935, Liberals used the slogan "King or Chaos" to win a landslide in that election of that year that defeated Bennett. Promising much-desired trade treaty with the U.S., the McKenzie King government passed the 1935 Reciprocal Trade Agreement. It marked a turning point in Canadian-American economic relations, reversing the disastrous trade war of 1930 and 31, set off by Smoot-Hawley, lowering tariffs and yielding a dramatic increase in trade. More subtly, it revealed to the Prime Minister and the President that they could work well together, and they did have a good working relationship. The U.S. had passed, the U.S. Congress passed in 1934 the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act. They realized they screwed up with Smoot-Hawley, and Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act was designed to lower trade barriers and promote trade, and the U.S. would adopt this stance for the remainder, ever since then, and become the nation's champion of free trade. And Canada is still our most important trading partner. McKenzie King was really lucky. The worst of the Depression had passed by 1935, and he implemented relief programs such as the National Housing Act to promote the building and improvement of housing, the National Employment Commission to help people get jobs. His government also made the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation a crown corporation in 1936, nationalized it. Trans-Canada Airlines, the precursor to Air Canada, was created as a crown corporation in 1937. In 1939, Parliament passed the National Film Act, which created the National Film Board, which promotes and actually produces and distributes movies in Canada. So we see a lot of government enterprises. Curiously, after 1936, the Prime Minister lost patience with Westerners. The Westerners favored these more radical, smaller parties that wanted, more socialist-type schemes and as alternatives to his middle-of-the-road liberalism. Indeed, he came close to writing, and you can imagine why, because they were facing the same kinds of things that people in the West, the same ecological disaster people in the Western U.S. were facing. And indeed, he came close to writing off the whole region with his comment that The Prairie Dust Bowl was, quote, part of the U.S. desert area. I doubt if it will be of any real use again, unquote. This didn't endear him to Westerners. Instead, he paid more attention to the industrial regions and needs of Ontario and Quebec regarding the proposed St. Lawrence Seaway project with the United States. And this is where most Canadians actually still live, either on the far western coast or in the east. As for the unemployed, he was also, like Bennett, hostile to federal relief and reluctantly accepted a Keynesian solution that involved federal deficit spending, tax cuts, and subsidies to the housing market.